Good morning, everyone. Today, we're going to look at the poetry of the Great War. Now, the Great War, 1914, 1918, was one of the most cataclysmic events in history, probably perhaps the most cataclysmic event as far as Western Europe was concerned, in since the fall of the Roman Empire. The conflict consumed perhaps 10 million lives. It was also the first great industrial war. It was the first time competing industrial technologies have been pitted against each other. And the range of weapons and their potential for mass destruction was enormous, far greater than in previous conflicts. Many listeners will remember that the famous slogan of 1914 was, "It'll be all be over by Christmas." And of course, it wasn't over by Christmas, not by Christmas 1914, 1915, 1916, 1917. It only ended in November 1918. One of the bequests of the war is the volume of poetry which it has left to us. Many of these poets, people like Siegfried Sassoon, Robert Graves, Wilfred Owen, are of course extremely famous, and their works, quite rightly, are recited very frequently and contained in all the anthologies. And this morning I will be reciting some of the better known poems, but I'll be interspersing them with some which are not so well known. These are poems written mainly by individual soldiers, ordinary individuals, which have been left in archives for decades. When I was researching for my own anthology of hitherto unpublished Great War poems, I came across vast reams of work hidden away in archives, particularly in military archives. And this is poetry not written by professional poets, written by soldiers, either for their mates, for their family, or just because they had some downtime. And whilst these generally don't feature in any of the major anthologies, they're still worth listening to. But I'm going to start off with Rupert Brooke, the doyen of the pre-war romantics, who wrote his famous poem, The Soldier, in 1914. This was at a time when there was huge enthusiasm for the war, where it had a romantic gloss that the reality would soon dispel. Brooke himself, however, though he volunteered, died in the Greek islands from an infected insect bite. He didn't die gloriously. Nonetheless, his poem has endured. The Soldier. If I should die, think only this of me, that there's some corner of a foreign field that is forever England. There shall be in that rich earth a richer dust concealed, a dust whom England bore, shaped, made aware, gave once her flowers to love, her ways to roam. A body of England's breathing English air, washed by the rivers, blessed by sons of home. And think, this heart, all evil is shed away, a pulse in the eternal mind, no less, gives somewhere back the thoughts by England given. Her sights and sounds, dreams happy as her day, and laughter learned of friends and gentleness, in hearts at peace, under an English heaven. Now, the enthusiasm of 1914 very quickly gave way to a kind of weary resignation produced by the stalemate in the trenches. And one poem I came across a few years ago, an anonymous officer, probably somebody in the Northumberland Fusiliers, we don't really know, it gives a more humorous take on the stalemate of 1915. It wasn't funny at all, but Tommy has always found a balm in humour, which sometimes the more formal poets tend to overlook. This is called The Things That Matter. It was in the war in 1915, at early dawn one day. Our orders were to take the trench that opposite us lay. The battle raged around us fierce, the air was thick with shell, but no man flinched as we advanced to drive the Hun to hell. Our object gained, we paused a while to gain our breath, much needed. And all this time, I'll have you know, the battle still proceeded. The ground behind us now was swept by all the hostile guns, to stop reserves from coming up, a habit of the Huns. Glancing back, to my surprise, I suddenly observed from out the smoke a bigger rush, a VC he deserved. "Go back," I cried, "go back at once." My words passed quite unheeded. And all this time, as I've said, the battle still proceeded. He reached our trench, though wounded thrice, and as he fainted, a message forming to my hand that gallant soldier planted. "What's this?" I gasped as I read the message written there. "Report at once the method used by you to cut men's hair." "No time to lose," I shouted out. "Now who will volunteer to take the answer back at once?" "It will be late, I fear." "Let me go, sir." The cry went up from every lusty throat. I picked a man, then sat me down, and this reply I wrote. "The method used by me to cut the hair of men who need it is sometimes just to burn it off, and other times to weed it. And often rasps are used instead. These letters cause some bleeding. Oh, I'd like to add to let you know the battle's still proceeding." With bated breath, we watched him start. The gallant man selected to take the message back, by whom it was expected. It was with relief we saw him gain a spot from whence we knew he could proceed with safety with his message to HQ. "The war is won," I told my men. "No need to use our rifles. While those behind look after us, we need not think of trifles, such as the Hun in front of us, or when it's time for feeding." But I'll have you know, I have to say, the battle's still proceeding. So this cynicism, perhaps not quite cynicism yet, but more a kind of grim acceptance that the war was going to go on, that Tommy simply had to make the best of it, persisted throughout 1915. We see the mood of the poets begins to change from 1916 to 1917, when the ghastly grinding attrition of the Somme and then of the Third Battle of Ypres take a terrible toll both in lives and indeed on the morale, not to mention enthusiasm of the men serving. Another one that I came across in an archive, again anonymous, though I think it was penned by a soldier from the Northumberland Fusiliers, which is odd because it's one you feel ought to be recited with a kind of estuarial accent. However, it's called Puzzled, and it's never before been published. With occasional eating and drinking, and just 40 winks now and then, and work on the trenches, along with the Frenchies, we don't get much time for thinking, we men. And what me and my mate company just can't yet work out is what's this here culture they're talking about. Though we don't get no specials, we have had a round dozen who tell the same tale. How Germans will pillage a poor little village and quiet the natives by murder wholesale. And what me and my company ain't yet made out is what is this here culture they're talking about. They slash up the pictures with sabres, which seems a bit spiteful and mean. The searchlights they shows up, the churches they blows up, and cars are built while they've ended their labours. Thanks God. And what me and my company ain't yet worked out is what is this here culture they're talking about. The brave kindly men will strip lassies and mothers and wives to their skin, and when they're crying and open their dying, they will jeer at each one as she passes and grin. And what me and my company ain't yet worked out is what is this here culture they're talking about. I'm ready to not argument and frustrate at wagging me chin, but sharp as a bayonet I can't explain it, and I shan't till we've licked 'em and ended Berlin. Now, also in 1916, my great uncle was serving as part of the Royal Naval Division. Now, this was a naval unit that fought on land, never saw a ship. And of course, the Navy has very different ways of doing things from the Army. And the most battle which exercised the regular Army command of the division, a general shoot, and this, of course, was a very important matter during the Battle of the Somme, was how the division dug their latrines. The Navy do it differently. And they didn't take too kindly to Shute, who was a regular martinet, telling them how to do it. And the poem was written by A.P. Herbert, of course, who became famous after the war, and it's called The General Inspecting the Trenches. Once you've heard it, you'll understand why it doesn't tend to appear in too many anthologies. The general, inspecting the trenches, exclaimed with a horrified shout, "I refuse to command a division which leaves its excreta about." And certain responsible critics made haste to reply to his words, observing that his staff advisers consisted mainly of turds. But nobody took any notice. No one was prepared to refute that the presence of shit was congenial compared to the presence of shoot. Now, shit may be shot at odd corners, paper supplied there to suit, but a shit would be shot without mourners if somebody shot that shit shoot. I recited that poem a few years ago at the Royal Military Academy, Sandhurst, as part of a dinner lecture. I had realised that my host, who was sitting next to me, was actually a Colonel Shute, who was the grandson of General Shute. Bad news to say I wasn't asked back for about another 5 years. Now, the next one is a short one I'm going to recite, which is by Siegfried Sassoon. Sassoon was one of the famous war poets. And he wrote a brilliant little poem, which is set at the time of Arras, Battle of Arras, in April, Easter 1917. This is called The General. Good morning, the General said, when we met him last week on our way to the line. Now the soldiers he smiled at are most of them dead, and were cursing his staff as incompetent swine. He's a cheery old card, said Harry to Jack, as they marched to Arras with rifle and pack. But he did for them both with his plan of attack. And one of the most famous of the war poets, of course, is Wilfred Owen. In my opinion, he is perhaps the finest of the great war poets. When I was at school, it was really Graves and Sassoon were considered to be the prime writers of great war verse, but Owen has now come into his own. I'm going to read a few of his. The first one is called The Sentry, and this was actually written in a captured German bunker in the early part of 1917, actually, being to the site where that bunker stood, but it doesn't really matter. It's a universal poem, and it's called The Sentry. We found an old Boche dugout, and he knew, and gave us hell, for shell on frantic shell hammered on top and never quite burst through. Rain guttering down in waterfalls of slime kept slush waist high, that rising hour by hour choked up the steps too thick with clay to climb. What murk of air remained stack old and sour, with fumes of whiz-bangs and smells of men who'd lived there years and left their curse in the den, and not their corpses. There we heard it from the blast of whiz-bangs, but one found our door at last, buffeting eyes and breath, snuffing the candles. And thud, thump, thud, down the steps came thumping and splashing in the flood, deluging muck. The sentry's body, then his rifle, handles of old Boche bombs, mud in ruck on ruck. We dredged him up for killed until he whined. Oh, sir, my eyes, I'm blind, I'm blind, I'm blind. Coaxing, I held a flame against his lids and said if he could see the least blurred light, he was not blind. In time he'd get all right. I can't, he sobbed. Eyeballs, huge, bulged like squids, watch my dreams still. But I forgot him then, in posting next for duty, and sending a scout to beg a stretcher somewhere, and floundering about to other posts under the shrieking air. Those other wretches, how they bled and spewed, and one who would have drowned himself for good. I try not to remember these things now. Let dread hark back for one word only, how? Half listening to that sentry's moans and jumps, and the wild chattering with broken teeth, renewed most horribly whenever crumps pummeled the roof and slogged the air beneath. Through the dense din, I say, we heard him shout, I see your lights! But ours had long gone out. Owen is one of that generation of poets who became increasingly disenchanted with the war, like indeed Sassoon. And Owen, like Sassoon, was for a while immured in Craig Lockhart, the Army's mental hospital, because it was felt that anybody who was unpatriotic had therefore by definition to be insane. Nonetheless, his output continued. Owen himself, as did indeed Sassoon, both won the Military Cross. One I think of his most telling poems is Dulce et decorum est. Bent double, like old beggars under sacks, knock-kneed, Coughing like hags, we cursed through sludge, till on the haunting flares we turned our backs, and towards our distant rest began to trudge. Men marched to sleep. Many had lost their boots, but limped on, blood-shod. All went lame, all blind, drunk with fatigue, deaf even to the hoods of gas shells dropping softly behind. Gas! Gas! Quick, boys! An ecstasy of fumbling, fitting the clumsy helmets just in time. But someone still was yelling out and stumbling, and floundering like a man in fire or lime. Dim through the misty panes and thick green light, as under a green sea, I saw him drowning. In all my dreams, before my helpless sight, he plunges at me, guttering, choking, drowning. If, as in some smothering dream, you too could pace behind the wagon that we flung him in, and watch the white eyes writhing in his hanging face like a devil sick of sin. If you could hear at every jolt the blood come gargling from the froth-corrupted lungs, bitten as the cud of vile, incurable sores upon innocent tongues, my friend, you would not tell with such high zest to children ardent for some desperate glory the old lie, dulce et decorum est, patria mori. Owen himself, of course, did not survive the war. He was killed in 1918 during the attack on the San Quentin Canal. Graves and Sassoon both did survive the war. Many other poets like Rosenthal, Hodgson, were also killed. And for me, I think one of the most poignant poems that ever did come out of the war was one of Owen's last, which is called Disabled. It's about the experience of someone who has, of course, been permanently disabled, his lifespan radically shortened by the war. Has a personal connection. My wife's grandfather was one of these, and he was badly injured as a gunner on the Somme in 1916 and suffered from a suppurating wound that never properly healed. And it eventually did for him, killed him, but in 1946, so 30 years after. But his normal lifespan was cut radically short. He was still, I think, in his late 40s. Now, of course, he is one of tens of hundreds of thousands of men and women who suffered crippling and life-changing injuries, but they're not mentioned on any war memorial, nor do they have a Commonwealth War Graves Commission grave. They are casualties of war nonetheless, which is why Disabled, for me, certainly has a particular resonance. Disabled. He sat in a wheeled chair, waiting for dark, and shivered in his ghastly suit of grey, legless, sewn short at elbow. Through the park, voices of boys rang, saddening like a hymn, voices of play and pleasure after day, till gathering sleep had mothered them from him. About this time used to swing so gay, when glow lamps budded in the light blue trees, and girls glanced lovelier as the light grew dim. In the old times, before he threw away his knees. Now he will never feel again how slim girls' waists are, how warm their subtle hands, or then touch him like some queer disease. He was an artist, silly for his face. He was younger than his youth, last year. Now he is old. His back will never brace. He lost his colour very far from here, poured it down shell holes till the veins ran dry, and half his lifetime lapsed in the hot race, and leap of purple spurted from his thigh. One time he light a blood smear down his leg, after the matches carried shoulder high. It was after football, when he drunk a peg. He thought he'd better join. Wonders why. Someone had said he'd look a god in kilts. Well, that's why, and maybe too, to please his Meg. Aye, that was it. To please the giddy jilts. He asked to join. He didn't have to beg. Smiling, they wrote his lie, aged 19 years. Germans he scarcely thought of, and no fears of fear came yet. He thought of jewelled hilts for daggers in plaid socks, of smart salutes, and care of arms and leave and pay arrears, esprit de corps and heads for young recruits. And soon he was drafted out with drums and cheers. Some cheered him home, but not as crowds cheer go. Only a solemn man who brought him fruits thanked him, and then inquired about his soul. Now he will spend a few sick notes through 6 years in institutes, and do the things the rules consider wise. Take whatever pity they may do. Tonight, he noticed how the women's eyes passed from him to the strong men that were whole. How cold and late it is. Why don't they come? Put him to bed. Why don't they come? Although I think that is a wonderful poignant poem, and indeed it's well known, it's not the poem which of itself actually has come to symbolize the war. It's come to symbolize the idea of the poppy as the commemoration of the Great War. That poem was written by a surgeon, a man called Dr. John McCrae. He was a Canadian surgeon, a man in his 40s. He wasn't a young man who volunteered for service and served running an advanced dressing station during Ypres during the second battle. Tremendous fight. And this is in 1915, so this is a time when, if people are not yet cynical, there was a fair degree of resignation, a degree of fatalism. And his poem, In Flanders Fields, has perhaps more than any other come to symbolize the poignancy and suffering of the Great War. And I'll finish with this. In Flanders Fields, the poppies blow, between the crosses, row on row that mark our place. By the sky, the lark still bravely singing fly, scarce heard amidst the guns below. We are the dead. Short days ago we lived, loved and were loved, felt dawn, saw sunset glow, and now we lie in Flanders Fields. Take up our quarrel with the foe. To you, from failing hands, we throw the torch. Be yours to hold it high. If ye break faith with us who die, we shall not rest. The poppies grow in Flanders Fields. Thank you very much.
Good evening and welcome to Heritage Hour. We hope you enjoyed John's talk this evening, and it's a great pleasure to welcome John Sadler this evening to answer any questions that you might have about poetry of the First World War, or possibly indeed many other questions about the First World War. John is a military historian and local historian, and has got all sorts of interesting insights. So while we just give people a chance to type their questions into the comments box below this video, I do have a couple of questions for you, John, and I'm wondering if you can tell us a bit more about the sources that you used for your research as well. What was the raw material like, and was it hard to decipher the handwriting?
Thank you, Lucy. We're fortunate in this region because of the strong military and regimental connection that we have, that local archives contain a vast treasure trove of local verse written by soldiers, which has lain in the archives for a very long time. Gateshead Newcastle libraries, of course, Town and Weir archives, and particularly Durham County Record Office, which of course hold the archives for the Durham Light Infantry. There's a vast amount of interesting material, and then in all of my researches, I think I've probably only ever scratched the surface. Also, the Museum of the Northumberland Hussars, which is Charge Museum at Discovery Museum in Newcastle, has some extremely interesting material, as does the Museum of the Royal Northumberland Fusiliers in Alnwick Castle. And studying these archives is immensely interesting because the poetry one sees, also the letters and private memoirs and documents, many of which have never seen the light of day for a very long time. Good news is most of them were typed out at some point or other. So some, of course, are still handwritten, therefore there's a certain amount of effort involved in deciphering. But by and large, most of these were hammered out on old-fashioned typewriters. That's what I learned to type on. And therefore, they're perfectly accessible. And of course, in normal times, when archives are open, all of these resources are available for everybody.
So were you going into the archives then? Because obviously, you know, we are getting used to the idea that things like Ancestry online, which you can access through the Gateshead Library's website for family history. There is so much online that has been digitized. When you're doing your research, is it more when you're actually attending the different places that you've told us about and looking through things there?
Yes, I think all of the material I've amassed over the years, and obviously going back some time now, and I've written quite extensively on the Great War, has been gleaned from actual archive sources. And to me, this is old-fashioned, I don't know, there's a particular fascination, particular excitement about handling a document which may not have been handled by anybody or seen the light of day for decades.
I can
And
imagine.
I think that gives you a kind of connection with the individual, with the writer. You may not know, a lot of them are anonymous. You don't know who wrote these, especially the unknown poems from local sources. You don't know who they are, but you do feel a level of connection when you handle a document that no online experience can really quite match.
Well, bring on the days when we're able to do that kind of research again. And obviously we are taking steps forward with reopening some of our services. And we do have Ring and Read at the moment and some PC access, but at the moment we're not doing quite the full extent of our services, but you know, fingers crossed for the next stage in the process of reopening. So I wonder if you would be able to share anything or talk about poetry or poets who wrote from a slightly different perspective. So I know that when we studied the war poets in history at school, I mean, we studied them in history, we studied them in English, we did cover them quite extensively, but we never looked at any German war poets. I wonder if you have got anything interesting, any insights about the German poetry from the other side.
I think all of us, and I'm probably a victim of this as well, have a kind of Tommy-centric approach that we look at the Great War through very much a British perspective. We tend not to think too much about our allies, the French, or indeed the guys on the other side of the line, the Germans, who of course are at the end of the day just like us. And there is quite a body of German poetry, not all of which has been translated. But of course, perhaps the greatest novel to come out of the Great War is written by a German writer, Erich Maria Remarque, All Quiet on the Western Front, which is a brilliant work, been filmed numerous times. And I think actually there's another film of All Quiet on the way. And we find with the German poets, the German, again, who are German soldiers, Fritzes, Germany's Tommies, who are writing in the trenches, there's a very similar strand comes out. That they have started with this deep feeling of patriotism, exactly the same as our guys do. But the war itself brings a whole measure of cynicism. I read an account by a man called Armourer Patterson, who's a British officer who's captured in 1918, cavalry officer, but his horse was shot from under him, wounded and captured. And he wrote a very interesting account of his time in captivity, which was about 6 months. He was treated well by German medics, and whilst recovering from his injury, he was taken by a train deeper into Germany towards a POW camp, which effectively ended up in East Germany. His escort was an aging Landwehr, an old chap who had actually fought in the War of 1870. And he found that as they got to various German stations, there was a lot of anti-British feeling. And he and his escort were mobbed, and his escort had to fight people off. And the old chap turns around to Patterson and says, look, you know, they're not such bad people, really. You can't blame them for this. It's propaganda. They just don't know. They've never been to the front. So the actual German soldiers saying, look, you know, you and I, we're pretty much the same. The people back home who've been whipped up by propagandist sentiment just don't quite get what it's like at the front. And that is echoed many times in the equivalent Tommy verse. So Fritz and Tommy certainly had very, very similar experiences. And by and large, there wasn't a lot of rancor between the average German soldier and the average British soldier. In general, Germans always behaved punctiliously towards British wounded, and in general, as we did towards theirs. In terms of a particular poem that I might select, and again, partly because it's never going to be in any anthology, is A.P. Herbert's poem, The General Inspection of the Trenches. That's a wonderfully scatological poem. It's poking fun at the military establishment. It's certainly pretty hard on his commanding officer, General Shute. You see why Herbert never got beyond lieutenant. but it shows that vein of humour and irony, which runs through all of Tommy's poems. People like Sassoon, Graves, and Owen are professional poets. That's what they do. They almost do this for a living.
Right.
So they're writing for an audience, whereas Tommy is writing for himself, his family, and his mates. And that's the difference, I think.
That sounds really interesting. It would be nice if we could maybe put a link up to the poem that you mentioned
Yes.
in the comments later on. So that would be really interesting to see. Thank you. And I know that, you know, there are also poems written from the back home perspective here in the UK as well. Do you have any poems that you've enjoyed that kind of give the female perspective or the non-combatant?
Actually, funny enough, there's not much that I'm aware of. It must exist, but certainly in terms of out there in the public arena, there's very little from, as you might say, non-combatant poets. Women who are either, obviously, many women, of course, are heavily involved in the war effort. The war could not have been won without the efforts of the munitionettes at the Devil's Porridge in Gretna Green and many other such factories. As far as I'm aware, these young women, probably because they're working so hard, haven't left us any of their memoirs in verse, which is a great shame, because I'm sure they'd be they'd be very interesting to read. So if you like the women's side, the home front side, and just because the munitionettes are working in the home front doesn't mean they're safe. What they're doing is extremely dangerous.
Yes.
Of course, hundreds in the course of the war are killed by explosions, and many thousands more suffer significant health problems because of the pollutants involved in the process. But we don't really hear from them in terms of verse, which is a great shame.
It's perhaps something to do with the fact that we, you know, it's in a way an anomaly that we do have such good records from the front, because the regiments and the different military record keeping was so good.
Yes, I think that's right. What tends to happen is when a veteran, an old soldier, when he dies, his family very often bundle up his papers and lodge these with the regimental museum. So we do have in all of our, and of course we have such a strong tradition with our local regiments, within the Thumland Fusiliers, Thumland Hussars, with the Durham Light Infantry, and of course, the Green House in North Yorkshire, and the King's Own Scottish Borderers in the north of the Thumland. We do have such a strong regimental tradition that that's really, I think, how so much archive material ends up in these museums, because the papers of old soldiers are either gifted by the men themselves during their lifetime or handed on by their descendants and beneficiaries when they die.
So interesting, thank you. We do have a question from Anthea. Hi, Anthea. She says, John, is there a well-known war poet who you think is overrated? And if so, why?
I've got to be careful with this, haven't I? When I was young, it was Sassoon and Graves were the two main poets. And obviously we read Goodbye to All That. Well, Owen wasn't as famous. I think Owen is a brilliant poet. I don't think he's in any way overrated. At the risk of being controversial, and there'll be many fans of Robert Graves who will want to lynch me for this, I think Graves is overrated. Sorry. I like Sassoon, most of it. I think some of his gets a bit heavy. Graves, I find, is a bit heavy. Owen, I think, gets the whole mood of it just about right. As do the slightly lesser poets like Earl Hodgson, Isaac Rosenberg, people like that. So this is absolutely sacrilegious. I think Graves is actually slightly overrated. Sorry.
Well, you were asked, and we are entitled to an opinion about such matters, I think. So, anybody else with any other questions, or if you'd like to share a poem that you like or have found interesting, then do pop that in the comments. I was wondering, with regards to the poetry, I feel is so different when it's read aloud than when you're reading it off the page. Certainly for me anyway. And I wondered whether the poems that you have shared with us, whether you feel that they're poems that whether there was a culture of sharing poetry amongst the troops spoken, or was it a more private matter written and sent home?
It's quite hard to say. I suspect a lot of men in the kind of, macho culture of the trench of the battalion, might have felt a bit embarrassed at sharing poems. I think the majority of poems, certainly from the unknown or lesser known poets, the sort of people whose writing you discover in regimental archives,
Mhm.
I think they were primarily writing for their families. They were writing to the folks back home. They were not writing really for posterity. They weren't writing for a wider audience. They weren't writing for the newspapers. They weren't writing to become famous as poets. They were writing to their families because that was a way they could express themselves, kind of safety valve, I think. And it was perhaps a way they could express sentiments which, if they put in prose, they might struggle with. So I really think it was a safety valve for individual soldiers and officers writing back to their families. And obviously, poetry wouldn't be as censored as letters, because you're not really giving any information away. So it's probably quite a good way to communicate without having the censor's broad black pen score through most of what you've written.
Wow, that's so interesting. I hadn't thought of that, but yes, I can quite see how the way of communicating is so less concrete. That's really interesting. Thank you so much. So, do we have any more questions? Let's have a little look. I'm just going to refresh the page to see.
Cool.
Right. Yes, I think we're out of questions for the moment.
Fine. Good.
So thank you very much, everybody, for coming along and watching tonight and listening to the poetry. If you do think of a particular poem that you'd like to share with us, I know that I really enjoyed hearing about you sharing the general inspecting the trenches down in Sandhurst. That is quite an anecdote. I found that very entertaining. So if anybody else enjoyed any of John's choices or would like to share a different one, please do add to the comments. Thank you very much for being with us here this evening, John, and we look forward to welcoming you back soon. Next week, we have Anthea Lang with a talk on notable women of Gateshead. So we do hope you'll be back next Tuesday evening for that. And in the meantime, we have a feedback survey with a prize draw for anybody who's been watching or following Heritage Hour. The prize is the choice of one book from the Gateshead Archive shop. So to enter, you just need to complete a short survey to tell us a little bit about how you found Heritage Hour over the last year. And it will be really helpful for us just to get some feedback. And we wish you good luck in the prize draw. I'll pop the link in the comments box so you can see it there. And thank you very much for watching. It's been really interesting to hear more from you, John, about the different poets and the archives as well. So thank you so much.
Marvellous. See everybody next time. Bye for now.